Hello, everyone. Good morning. Or should I say?
Good morning.
Professor Koch. Good noon or good morning. All right. Anyway, today we are very glad to have Professor and Dr. Anton Friedrich Koch to give us his thought on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. For those who were not with us last time, Professor Anton Friedrich Koch is a retired professor of the Department of Philosophy at the University of Heidelberg. He also used to teach at University of Munich and the University of Tübingen. He was a visiting professor at a couple of overseas institutions, including Emory University and the University of Chicago. Also, Professor is a full member of the Heidelberg Academy of Science. Professor Koch is specialized in ancient Greek philosophy, German idealism. Of course, that includes Hegel, and philosophy language. He has authored, at least because I checked it online, I'm not sure I get the full list, at least 8 books, and there must be hundreds of articles, because on your website at Tübingen, I found you published, since last year, you have already published like 20 articles. That's very impressive. Okay, yeah. Incredibly impressive, I would say. So I'm sure we can learn a lot from Professor Koch today. And his talk, which is the second one, is entitled From Phenomenology of Spirit to the Philosophy of Science. I think that's all. I'll give it to you, Professor Koch.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tang, and good evening to all of you. So, yeah, from the phenomenology of spirit to the science of logic today. We are currently, since the previous lecture, looking at the 25 years of philosophy between the publication of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason in 1781 and the completion of Hegel's manuscript of the Phenomenology of Spirit in 1806. Now we arrive at the last section of these reflections, and then we will move on to the science of logic. So let me begin with remarks on the phenomenology of spirit. While the 25 years of philosophy were slowly coming to an end, Hegel planned a system of philosophical science in 2 parts, the science of the experience of consciousness and a logic plus Realphilosophie, and worked on the first part, which was to appear in the spring of 1806. However, through discoveries made in writing, the science of the experience of consciousness grew into a veritable phenomenology of spirit, which was not published until more than a year later in 1807. According to Hegel's diagnosis, natural consciousness, after thousands of years of work, had now finally reached the point where science and scientific philosophy had appeared and had articulated themselves, or itself, philosophy itself, in some individuals. Kant and Fichte had provided all the essentials, and in Schelling's philosophy of identity, suitably modified by Hegel, of course, philosophical science had become a real phenomenon. Its lingual representations existed in Schelling's books and in the articles by Schelling and Hegel, and its content existed in the thinking consciousness of these authors and that of their thoughtful readers. The more productive of the 2 authors was Schelling for the time being, but Hegel may have already considered himself the more insightful of the 2, given his nascent system. Anyway, philosophical science had appeared in news and could now be elaborated and hopefully be raised from the de facto status of a science pretender among many to the rank of a generally accepted science, thus completing the evolution of natural consciousness into science. That at least was Hegel's hope. Part one of Hegel's system was intended to reconstruct in an ideal, typical way the path of natural consciousness from its earliest beginnings to absolute knowledge, the starting point of speculative logic and philosophy. This had to be done without dogmatism, that is, in such a way that the skeptic could agree in principle. Hegel keeps the spatio-temporal field of consciousness fixed as a constant scenario, but tacitly does so in a skeptical epoche, a bracketing of all claims to objective knowledge and objective truth, that is, in the mode of appearance or shine. Shine in the German triple sense. Shine is first light, moonshine, sunshine, sonnenschein, moonshine. Second, it is illusion, illusory shine. And third, in German, it is also a document or a certificate. The driver's license is the driver's shine in Germany. You show the shine. I have the right to drive a car. Here's my driver's shine. So shine in German has these three meanings: light, illusion, and documentation. Natural consciousness itself is not satisfied with this, of course, with the epoche, but claims objective knowledge of what is real on the basis of an implicit conception of the categorial form of real objects. Its many individual knowledge claims are empirical, to be sure, and as such, not the subject of an a priori philosophical phenomenology. What the phenomenology investigates is the proto-ontology of consciousness, that is, the general a priori and categorial knowledge claim that permeates and informs the empirical knowledge claims at each major step in the evolution of consciousness throughout human history. If, as Hegel believes, the historical evolution of the proto-ontology of natural consciousness is based on a hidden conceptual necessity, which must be discovered and scientifically presented with the participation of the skeptic, then botanizing is not permitted. Empirical botanizing is not permitted. Rather, the beginning of the examination must be made with the proto-ontology that is devised as the simplest and most immediate among all possible candidates. The initial consciousness must accordingly conceive the spatio-temporal scenery as a sheer multiplicity of distinct individual items, which are simply there. And as exactly such a multiplicity of independent individuals, they must then be epistemically accessible to consciousness, hence presumably as individual sense impressions, presumably, we'll see. The first chapter of the Phenomenology shows, however, that a multitude of immediate, distinct individuals could not possibly be accessible to consciousness as such, that is, as many individuals, but on the contrary, only in the form of various very general traits. Thus, the proto-ontology of the logically first shape of consciousness generates a proto-epistemology that is diametrically opposed to it. The conception of the categorial form in which the real is in itself, and the conception of the categorial form in which it is for it, that is for consciousness, fall apart without any relation. The initial shape of consciousness, Hegel calls it sense certainty, is structurally false consciousness, or rather not yet an actual consciousness at all, because its proto-ontology and its proto-epistemology not only do not coincide, but also do not have any points of contact in the first place. The super-Platonist sit venia verbo proto-epistemology totally misses the super-nominalist proto-ontology. The argumentation leading to this result will not be reconstructed here. I skipped that. That's the first chapter. Instead, the method of the phenomenology will now be illustrated in a short outline of the relevant Hegelian points. Of course, if one does not want to lose the skeptic, the method cannot be sufficiently justified in advance, that is, before the content of the work is developed, but it can only be read afterwards from the actual course of the development. Hegel, however, gives the readers the introduction, a sketch of the method in advance, based on his knowledge of the progression, and he thereby formulates his variant of the theorem of consciousness that had been invented by Reinhold. Now here is Hegel's variant, Hegel's version of this theorem. Consciousness, he says, I quote, distinguishes something from itself to which it relates itself at the same time. Or, as this is expressed, there is something for it, that is for consciousness, and the determined, not just determinate, the determined side or term of this relating or of the being of something for a consciousness is knowledge, or knowledge claims. From this being for another, however, we distinguish the being in itself. That which is related to knowledge is as well distinguished from it and posited as being the case or existing, the difference is not yet made, also outside this relationship. The side of this in itself is called truth, end of quote. Consciousness is introduced here as the duality of a for it and an in itself, thus of an implicit conception of the categorical form of the real as it is present to consciousness, and an implicit conception of the real as it is in itself. That is a proto-epistemology and a proto-ontology. The epistemic side, the knowing, the for it, is to be determined by the ontic side, the truth, the in itself, the real in itself, as the determining, the active one. Consciousness thus claims, in the spirit of moderate everyday realism, to have its knowledge be determined by the in itself. Not only with regard to empirical knowledge claims, but first and foremost with regard to categorical form. When Hegel says that from the for it, now quote, however we distinguish the being in itself, end of quote, the adversative however is to be drawn to the being in itself, not to we. It is not we, qua theorists, as opposed to natural consciousness, but it is we, qua, or at least on behalf of natural consciousness, who distinguish from the for it the being in itself. For we as theorists must not commit ourselves to any presumably true in itself. That would be illegitimate dogmatism. We may only take note of the naive dogmatism of natural consciousness without signing it. The in itself is the categorical conception that consciousness possesses of the real, and the for it is the categorical conception that consciousness possesses of the epistemic accessibility of the real. According to the general categorical knowledge claim of consciousness, both conceptions ought to be identical in categorical coinage and structure, and differ only in their role as ontic or epistemic logical form, respectively. This is what the knowledge claim of consciousness amounts to. If, for example, the real, according to its categorical form, is a multiplicity of simple, distinct individuals, then it should also be epistemically accessible under this same categorical form. But the examination in the first chapter that I skipped has shown the opposite. If the real consists of distinct individuals, then it is accessible in the form of highly general features. This means that firstly, this particular for it is discredited as the determined side or the dependent variable in the duality of consciousness. The in itself as the determining side or independent variable, on the other hand, is the yardstick or standard for the truth evaluation of the for it. But the negative truth evaluation falls back on the standard, because this particular standard was adopted by consciousness in the course of its general categorical claim to knowledge and truth as an attempt to conceive the in itself in a superlatively primitive and presuppositionist way. Thus, consciousness in its initial shape or form posited that the real in itself consisted of distinct individual entities to be referred to without general concepts by pure indexicals alone, like this or here or now or there, indexicals alone. And it experienced to its own surprise and frustration that these entities would then only be accessible as a multiplicity of very general traits. Positing that the real consists of primitive individuals is an act that is not verifiable in principle, but on the contrary, falsifies itself, that is, falsifies the positing consciousness. Consciousness would therefore have to change its for it, but it cannot do so without further ado, because the for it is the dependent variable, which only changes when the independent variable, the in itself or the object, is changed. Therefore, as Hegel puts it, in the examination of a given categorical knowledge claim, not only that claim, but also the object itself, as conceived under the adopted in itself, I quote Hegel, does not withstand, or the standard of the examination changes if that for which it was supposed to be the standard does not stand the examination. And the examination is not only an examination of the knowledge claim, but also of the standard of the examination, that is, of the in itself. End of quote. But where should a new standard come from if the examination turned out negative? Well, there's exactly one possible candidate for a new in itself in the place where we now stand, the former for it, because no other categorical conception has so far been found or deduced. The spatio-temporal scenery must therefore now be conceived by consciousness as consisting of highly general phenomenal qualities. Hegel calls this new form of consciousness perception in chapter 2, the Phenomenology. And in the introduction speaks of a reversal of consciousness with regard to the method. Consciousness has experienced that the former in itself was an in itself only for it, for consciousness, and now puts the for it that resulted from the in itself in the position of the new in itself. This leads to a new examination in order to find out whether the new in itself generates a categorical congruent for it. Well, it would only have to reproduce itself in the role of the new for it. Unfortunately, or rather fortunately, this is not the case. Unfortunately, because consciousness thus does not yet achieve its self-coherence. Fortunately, because the science of the experience of consciousness must continue and can uncover more categorical structure. Consciousness can be imagined as the phenomenal spatio-temporal field bracketed in skeptical epoche, in the role of an input-output apparatus. Well, that is just an illustration. So think of consciousness as the perceptual field around you, which is bracketed in epoche. Maybe it's all illusion. And then take consciousness as this input-output machine, this apparatus. We enter the simplest conceivable input, simplest conceivable in itself or object, and the apparatus outputs a de facto incongruent for it, or knowledge form. We enter this for it as the new in itself, and again receive an incongruent for it, which we then enter as a third in itself, and so on, until hopefully a fixed point is reached where input and output finally come to coincide, and a categorically adequate absolute knowledge emerges. On the way to this point, consciousness experiences a continuous self-correction in its categorical thinking, which we as theorists recognize as necessary. Consciousness doesn't. For consciousness, it's just experience. It stumbles from one categorical form to the next, but we as theorists see the necessity in this process. Hegel had originally assumed that with the conceptual journey through the forms of consciousness in the narrower sense in chapters 1 to 3, sense certainty, perception, understanding, and of self-consciousness, chapter 4, as well as of reason, chapter 5, the investigation would be completed and the fixed point reached. In fact, however, this part of the journey only fills the first half of the text of the Phenomenology. The experience of consciousness obviously has not yet come to a halt at a fixed point, where input and output coincide. As Eckhart Förster convincingly showed, Hegel had to correct himself and, under great time pressure, enrich the investigation with materials that actually, as turned out years later, belong in the philosophy of spirit, in the philosophy of objective and absolute spirit. In consequence, 2 long chapters on spirit, number 6, and religion, chapter 7, follow before absolute knowledge can be addressed in the short final chapter 8. Thus, the planned science of the experience of consciousness had grown under work into a veritable phenomenology of spirit. And that's the title of the book as we have it. Okay, now the fixed point. This fixed point, absolute knowledge, is double-edged and must be so that from it a progression into philosophy, into science, into logic becomes possible and necessary. On the one hand, the general categorical knowledge claim of consciousness is now fulfilled. That is, filled with truth. Knowledge claim and truth coincide. The fallibility of finite consciousness, which claims to know about independent objects, is overcome in the identity of the for it and the in itself. We no longer merely claim to know, but find ourselves in categorical knowledge, even if we remain fallible in our empirical truth claims. Of course, we always remain fallible in the empirical claims. Yeah. And in this categorical, genuinely philosophical knowledge, truth is revealed ex post as the process of the successive alternate shapes or forms of consciousness, none of which is in itself the truth about consciousness, just as neither the bud, nor the bloom, nor the fruit is in itself the truth about the plant, as Hegel says, by way of comparison in the introduction. On the other hand, when the for it and the in itself come together in one single categorical shape, there is nothing left that could still account for their difference in logical roles. And consciousness, of course, depends on this difference of roles, on this opposition of roles. Thus, consciousness itself collapses together with its defining duality. And absolute knowledge becomes, as Hegel puts it, now a sequence of quotations. So absolute knowledge becomes, as Hegel puts it, a going into itself of spirit, in which it, that is spirit, is sunken in the night of its self-consciousness. But its disappeared existence is kept in it. The disappeared existence is kept in that night. And so spirit has to start anew, unbiased, and to raise itself, to educate itself again, as if everything that went before was lost for it, end of quote. So with the logic, we start completely from scratch. This new start is to happen in the science of logic, and then to be continued in the Realphilosophie, the philosophy of real matters, that is the philosophy of nature and spirit. So that was all I wanted to say about the phenomenology. And now let us pass on finally to the science of logic, which is the real topic of all these lectures. With the expansion of the science of consciousness to the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel had, malgré lui, thrown his Jena conception of the system of sciences overboard without gaining another. Rather, the phenomenology represents a phase of productive disorder in his plans, which only comes to an end in the science of logic that appeared between 1812 and 1816. The new and stable conception of the system is then bindingly revealed from 1807 onwards in his Encyclopedia, the third edition of which in 1830 will be used as a textual basis in the following. The first 5 chapters of the Phenomenology of 1807, which formed the science of the experience of consciousness, are condensed in the Encyclopedia under the new, now too broad heading, the Phenomenology of Spirit. It's just the science of consciousness, to form the middle part of the first section, which is called Subjective Spirit, of the Philosophy of Spirit. So the Encyclopedia is no longer a preface to the philosophical science, but is just put into a part of the Realphilosophie, into the philosophy of spirit there. The materials from the second half of the Phenomenology of Spirit concerning objective spirit and religion are now located in the remaining sections and parts of the philosophy of spirit. The place of absolute knowledge, which was supposed to provide the progression into logic in 1807, is now taken by so-called absolute spirit, which is the final destination of the whole system, at the end of the whole philosophical system, notably by its highest form, namely, after art and religion, philosophical science. So it all ends with the fixed point, absolute, the absolute spirit, and in particular with the philosophical science. Back in 1807, Hegel had announced the experience of consciousness as a path of despair, not just doubt, not just Zweifel. Zweifel, well, zwei is two. If you are twofold Zweifels, you are doubting. You are drawn between two sides. So Zweifel, but Verzweiflung, despair. So it's the path of doubt or skepticism is the path of despair, namely the experience of consciousness. It's not just the skepticism relative to this or that claim, but it's total skepticism, Verzweiflung, despair. And self-consummating skepticism, as Hegel says, self-consummating, selbst vollbringend. The German verb vollbringen would be literally to bring full, to bring to its full, right? To consummate. Okay, so I say that again. Back in 1807, Hegel had announced the experience of consciousness as a path of despair and as self-consummating skepticism, and as the detailed history of the forming, the Bildung, the education, the Bildung of consciousness itself into science. And now it is said in the encyclopedia in section 78, in the hypothetical subjunctive, that is in counterfactual talk, in the Irrealis, I quote, skepticism as a negative science carried out through all forms of knowing would, there's the counterfactual talk, would present itself as an introduction, like back in 1807, the Phenomenology. It would present itself as an introduction, but it would also be superfluous, a superfluous way, because the dialectical, that is the negatively rational skeptical side itself, is an essential moment of affirmative science. The demand for such a consummate, brought to its full, skepticism is the same as the demand that science ought to be preceded by doubting everything. The demand that science ought to be preceded by doubting everything. That is, the complete presuppositionlessness with regard to everything. It is in fact the resolution to want to think purely, rein denken zu wollen. The resolution to want to think purely, achieved through freedom that abstracts from everything and grasps its pure abstraction, the simplicity of thinking. End of quote. So Hegel now says, we don't need the phenomenology as an introduction to science. We just need the resolution to want to think without presuppositions, and then start with the logic. Science then, by virtue of the free resolution to want to think purely, can now begin directly with the logic, which is preceded by nothing but complete presuppositionlessness. Thus the logic is the singular, strictly presuppositionless theory of science, and as such, it shall now be considered. So let us begin with the beginning of the presuppositionless theory. The logic, of course, deals, as does the complete Hegelian system, with precisely those themes and problems with which Kant and Spinoza, Reinhold and Enesidemus Schulze, Fichte and Jacobi, Schelling and the Jena Hegel had dealt. But for the time being, we may, indeed we should, forget that. In order to be able to begin without presuppositions, we have to play dumb and abstract from everything we believe or know. So, we do not presuppose anything. No doctrine, no terminology, no method, not even a topic. In all these respects, doctrinally, terminologically, methodologically, and thematically, the theory we are looking for must be presuppositionless. In a certain sense, we are looking for something impossible then, of course. Because a scientific theory is lingually and argumentatively articulated and controlled holding true of various theorems. How should we be able to abstract from this minimum of conceptual content and method and at the same time do science? We immediately see that we have to proceed on two tracks and divide our thinking into two levels. The basic level of pure, strictly presuppositionless thinking we are searching for, and the higher level of our background thinking through which we carry out this search. In Hegelian terminology, the thinking being sought, being searched or looked for, would be the relevant subject matter itself. And the seeking thinking is our external reflection. From now on, we shall speak of foreground and background theory, foreground and background logic. The foreground theory is pure presuppositionalist thinking proper, that is the relevant subject matter. And the background theory is Hegel's and our science of logic, which we want to approach in external reflection with as few presuppositions as possible and in a philosophically neutral way. We do not yet know the topic of the sought, the looked for, foreground logic. But our background logic has, in fact, already a topic, namely the foreground logic, including what the topic of the foreground logic will turn out to be. In the background logic, we also have beginnings of a terminology and a method, for we speak a natural language and talk in particular about the fact that we are looking for a presuppositionalist theory, so we need to have a prior understanding of what we mean by presupposition and by theory, at least. As far as our method is concerned, it is the unspecific scientific one of a justified holding true, and more specifically, that of reducing presuppositions. So we start in the background logic by considering how we could reduce presuppositions for the foreground logic. The aim is to radically and completely reduce presuppositions for the foreground logic as far as possible. As far as possible, even also for the background logic. So we want to be philosophically neutral in our background logic. We want to keep the background logic as free as possible from substantial preliminary decisions of a terminological, methodological, and doctrinal nature, and only tentatively set up the working hypothesis, that is our working hypothesis in the background logic, that there is a strictly presuppositionalist pure foreground thinking, which we want to examine together with a skeptic for its truth. In comparison, this absolutely presuppositionalist foreground logic may at first seem something completely out of the ordinary, that has nothing to do with our thinking. After all, the foreground logic would have to be wordless, if no terminology, whatever, is to be assumed. But on the way to the end of the Hegelian enterprise, if all goes well, the distance between us, that is our background logic, and pure thinking, that is the foreground logic, should become smaller and smaller and finally disappear. So that we want to be able, so that we would be able to recognize our background logic as the fully developed foreground logic. Within logic, however, this will not yet be possible. You have to go to the Realphilosophie to make that possible. Within logic, it will not yet be possible for the simple reason that we humans are spatio-temporal beings and must therefore wait with our performance until the Realphilosophie that considers the spatio-temporal. At the end of the philosophy of spirit, however, as the crowning glory of the Hegelian system, the cultural achievements of art, religion, and finally scientific philosophy will be considered under the heading of absolute spirit. And there we should be able to recognize ourselves and our background theory as the final theme of Hegelian philosophy. But these are, at the very beginning of the logic, the most distant dreams of the future, still far away. According to what has been said, we must always distinguish between our external reflection, the background logic, and pure thinking, the foreground logic. But it is just as important to consider a difference of levels or perspectives within the background logic. there may be different kinds of background logic possible. So let us imagine Hegel as a carny artist who builds a roller coaster and ghost train, Geisterbahn, leading to the absolute spirit, absolute ghost. So a roller coaster and ghost train on a fairground, a train that eventually leads its users to the absolute ghost or spirit. In a loop of 3 loops, a circle of 3 circles, an encyclopedia of 3 cyclical sciences, as Hegel says. The foreground logic is the track on which pure thought travels, and Hegel is the designer of the track. Firstly, he knows the construction principles and knows how the ghost train is built. And secondly, he has already completed some test rides and knows what is in store for pure thinking at the various stations, or what the users will experience there while thinking. He could therefore take up 2 different perspectives within the background logic, a designer perspective and a user perspective, and accordingly write 2 versions of the background logic. A long, complicated construction manual for potential designers who, like him, want to build a logical ghost train, and a shorter one for potential users to whom he wants to describe and explain the journey of pure thinking in advance. In the following, we therefore want to distinguish not only between the foreground logic and the background logic, but also within the background logic between the designer perspective and the user perspective, if necessary. And one more thing, the foreground logic is the fixed track of pure thinking. But just as a bird draws its circles without tracks, a virtuoso of pure thinking could possibly do without the tracks of the foreground logic and move in free thinking movements along the same path as a foreground logic user along his fixed track. Birds don't need the roller coaster to move in circles. Hegel envisions such virtuosity as an ideal. And in the background logic, in the user perspective, he likes to describe the free flight of pure thinking. In this respect, the designer perspective is more the background theory of the foreground logic, and the user perspective more the background theory of pure thinking itself. Okay. Since the foreground logic is wordless, the execution of pure thinking cannot be articulated lingually or linguistically, as is said in English, but I don't like the word linguistically because it refers to the science of linguistic. So articulated lingually, that is just articulated according to a language. Okay, again, since the foreground logic is wordless, the execution of pure thinking cannot be articulated lingually, but can at most be indicated externally by one-word sentences, such as being, nothing, becoming, and so on. And there are simple logical modifications like not being, or not nothing, or not becoming, and so on. The background logic, on the other hand, uses ordinary philosophical colloquial language in both perspectives. In the designer perspective, the path of pure thinking is built up argumentatively, that is constructed in detail. And in the user perspective, the thoughts that pure thinking thinks are at different stations named, that is, named as being, named as nothing, named as becoming, and so on, and then described, like Hegel says, being is indeterminate and immediate, and so on. Described in external reflection. And the transitions from one station to the next are motivated. For smart virtuosi of pure thinking, who are sufficiently emancipated from the logical path, the logical tracks, the Hegelian motivations may be as convincing as a sketchy proof by an experienced mathematician for his advanced colleagues. But the astonished freshman in the first semester would be lost without the intermediate steps in the proof. As far as the logic is concerned, these would have to be delivered in the background logic in the designer perspective. While Hegel, in order to get ahead with the work, which in the end will nevertheless grow to 3 volumes, almost always prefers the shorter user perspective. In this way, he makes faster progress, but encourages incomprehension and half-baked interpretations, which in fact deserve the ridicule to which Hegel himself was often subjected by smart-aleck philosophizers. By way of illustration, and because it is now in line with our agenda anyway, let us now quote the beginning of the main text of the logic. The first subsection, A, being, of the first chapter, being, of the first section, determinateness or quality, of the doctrine of, again, being. Okay, here is the quotation. The opening words of the science of logic, the main text of the science of logic. Hegel says, being, pure being, without any further determination. In its indeterminate immediacy, it is only equal to itself and also not unequal to another, has no difference within itself or to the outside. I skip some words. It is pure indeterminateness and emptiness. There is nothing, in small letters, in German small letters, nichts, to intuit it in it, if one can speak of intuiting here. But it is only this pure empty intuiting itself. There is also nothing to think in it, but it is equally this empty thinking. Being, the indeterminate immediate, is indeed nothing, now capitalized, nichts with a capital N. Being, the indeterminate immediate, is indeed nothing, and no more or less than nothing, again capitalized. End of quote. This then is directly followed by the next subsection, which is not much longer, B, nothing, and then by the longer subsection C, becoming, which extends to the end of the first chapter. So that was the first chapter, being, nothing, becoming. What is going on here? Well, Hegel first lends wordless pure thinking a word, an incomplete sentence, a kind of exclamation, being. And then, obviously, to be a little more precise, pure being. The addition without any further determination then clarifies purity. Usually, different senses of being are distinguished, as first in Aristotle in the Delta of his Metaphysics, chapter 7, and later in other ways, up to the present day. For example, we make a difference between veritative being, that is being the case, then existence, being in the sense of existing objects, then the copula in a predicative sentence, being, and identity, the predicate of identity called being, many senses of being. But in our text, something more general, something simpler is obviously meant, a being still beyond all distinctions. Second, Hegel tells us that this indeterminate being is something immediate, and third, something singular and incomparable. It is immediate insofar as it must be accepted in the foreground logic, that is, by pure thinking, as it is. It cannot be explained or derived from anything else. It is incomparable because it cannot be profiled in the foreground logic, by comparison with anything else. There's nothing else there in the foreground logic up to now. It is also fourthly empty, has no content of intuition or content of thought. If we are to speak of intuiting or thinking at all, pure being would be fifthly the empty, pure, A, intuiting, or B, thinking itself. Hegel thus expects us to be confronted with an astonishing sequence of equations. So pure being is identical to the empty content of intuiting or thinking. And again, identical to pure intuiting and identical to pure thinking. So there are all these identities, these equations. Astonishing. Finally, we learn that this pure being or intuiting or thinking is nothing, capitalized. That is, Hegel nominalizes the indefinite pronoun nothing into the nothing. But we do not receive any instructions as to what is to be thought under the capitalized and nominalized nothing. So, what to do with that? Nothing. It's very hard to come into this text, you see. And for an understanding through text exegesis, the matter is hopeless. You cannot, as an interpreter, in an exegetical way, learn what Hegel wants to convey here. Here, as in Hegel's logic, general exegesis won't lead us far. In not much else, but in this respect, the science of logic resembles a mathematical textbook, which likewise cannot be philologically and exegetically grasped and studied. We interpret literary texts, but not mathematical textbooks. A mathematical textbook can only be grasped and studied through careful subject-related argumentation or calculation. In mathematics, you calculate. You follow the text by doing the calculations on your own that are there in the textbook. The problem with the user perspective of the background logic, however, is that at this level, only sketchy and superficial arguments are given by Hegel. Anyone who wants to understand Hegel's logic must therefore, of course, according to Hegel's own rules, develop their own background theory in the designer perspective and compare it step by step with Hegel's background theory, which is mostly in the user perspective. So you must calculate or develop the science of logic on your own and then compare with what Hegel says and see if there's a match between what you calculated and what Hegel said, what you came up with and what Hegel comes up with. Like in a mathematical textbook, you do the calculation and look in the textbook, okay, I'm right. Hegel's singular basic rule of play must suffice for this. There's only one rule of play, nothing more. Build up a presuppositionless foreground logic. That's all. Just one rule for doing your own background logic. Build up a presuppositionless foreground logic. That's it. You don't get any more information, but that must suffice. Or rather, the presuppositionless foreground logic, because in it everything must be singular and without alternatives. There can only be one possible beginning and only one possible continuation to the next theorem or next theory station in the foreground logic. In our steps of constructing the path of pure thinking, which we carry out in our designer perspective background logic, we are freer and can choose for pragmatic reasons either one or the other procedure. We can, for example, construct all the stations strictly in sequence, one after the next, or the next after the first, or first leave a gap between two stations and close it afterwards by one or more intermediate stations, or the like. So we have certain freedom in the background logic to construct the roller coaster ghost train. It can begin here or there and then put in the intermediate stations. But in the end, however, all construction variants must result in the same alternativeless path of pure thinking. So the construction, we are free in the construction, but in the end, what is constructed must be one alternativeless path of pure thinking. By doing science, we claim knowledge and hold this and that to be true. With which knowledge claim, or with which truth, could the foreground logic start, qua pure thinking? The act and content to start with would have to be a singular, excessive, and alternativeless knowing or thinking, which for logical reasons nobody could effectively contest or deny. So we postulate, on the basis of our working hypothesis, something minimal and common, simple and general, which is stereotypically included and co-claimed in any particular claim to knowledge or truth, any claim that anyone can ever make. That is not any particular and determinate being the case, like the being white of snow or the being older than Plato, of Socrates, and so on, but universal, indeterminate being that permeates all these cases. About particular truth claims, one can in principle always argue, but pure being itself is co-claimed in all particular determinate claims and thus beyond possible dispute, by definition. That we call it being is arbitrary. We could give it any name we like, Gustav or Frida or whatever, but being seems to suggest itself and fulfills a mnemotechnical function. It reminds us that what remains when we abstract from all determinacies of different truth claims, namely nothing but the unmodified truth claim purely as such, and the corresponding indeterminate being the case purely as such. It's being the case purely as such. Well, we call it being, not Gustav. If pure thinking could speak, but it can't. If it could speak, it would perhaps raise this initial truth claim, which has no alternative and is completely neutral by means of the one-word sentence being. And this is exactly how the logic, as we have seen, actually begins. Being is the lingual expression that Hegel lends to the foreground logic. Then he himself takes the word in the user perspective of the background logic in his own person and describes in external reflection the content of the truth claim that was raised in the foreground logic. Because this claim and content was devised by abstraction from all determinacies of ordinary truth claims, it is indeterminate, at least for the foreground logic, although of course not for us in the background logic, because we, that is Hegel and the readers, determine it precisely as indeterminate, and in addition as immediate, as incomparable, and so on. Pure thinking, however, if it were not wordless anyway, would not and could not predicate anything of pure being, but could only hold it to be the case in a completely inarticulate way. This is to be hinted at with the one-word sentence being. Secondly, the content claimed with that one-word sentence, that is pure being, is immediate. Again, for pure thinking that thinks it in its very first thought, without deriving it from anywhere. For us, Hegel and the readers, on the other hand, being is mediated by the thoughtful omission of all determinate differences between possible truth claims, that is, by an act of negation, omission, or abstraction. Thirdly, being is incomparable. If we compare A with B, we have to find determinacies that they have in common. Both are, for example, red, and determinacies by which they differ. A is, for example, round and B square. In the case of being, however, we have only this, being, and it has no determinacies for pure thinking. It is therefore, in the foreground logic, an incomparable singularity, while in the background logic, of course, we can compare this foreground logic singularity with arbitrary other things. So we can compare pure being with anything we like in the background logic. Normally, we have to distinguish between a theory and its object or topic. Here's the theory, there's the topic. This would result here in the difference between, first, pure thinking, that's the foreground logic, and pure being, that is the topic of the foreground logic. And our topic in the background logic is the foreground logic. The topic of the foreground logic is being. These are three levels: background theory, foreground theory, being, topic of the foreground theory. But the indeterminate, immediate, incomparable object being is, fourthly, in its indeterminate immediacy and incomparability, completely neutral in content and empty, and is therefore grasped in an intuiting or thinking that no longer has the form of judgment or predication. Consequently, fifthly, pure intuiting or thinking and pure being merge, so that only two levels remain: that of the background theory and that of the foreground theory, which is at the same time that of its topic, the object. This coincidence of intuiting, thinking, and being must now be justified and explained. This will be the last point for today. An excursus into the theory or the conception of uncompounded, asyntheta or undivided, adihaireta facts would be helpful for this purpose. Such a conception is found in Aristotle. Its locus classicus is Metaphysics Theta, chapter 10. Indirectly also already in Plato, the Sophist. In another form, also in Bertrand Russell's assumption of knowledge by acquaintance. So that's the form that is most common to us, I think. Bertrand Russell, when he was talking about knowledge by acquaintance, was talking about these uncompounded facts. And it is, by the way, presupposed by all sense data theories. So sense data theories work with this conception of the asyntheta, of the uncompounded and undivided facts. Here, however, hints must suffice. Being was conceived in the designer perspective as the common core, which is co-stated in all statements and which is free of all conceivable modifications, by which something that is the case could differ from something else that is the case. Regarding such a core, pure thinking is immune to error, like in the cognition of sense data. We are supposed to be immune to error. Russell's knowledge by acquaintance is supposed to be immune to error. Aristotle's knowledge of the asyntheta, the uncompounded, is supposed to be immune to error. Thinking just cannot miss it. However, along with the possibility of error, the duality of consciousness, of objective in itself and subjective for it, ceases to exist. So when the possibility of error is withdrawn, the duality of consciousness vanishes as well. The immediacy of absolute knowledge emerges, and with it, absolute subject-object identity. Thus, in the designer perspective, background logic, we achieve the result and goal of the long path of the phenomenology in a short way, through the resolution to want to think purely, or through the working hypothesis that there is a presuppositionalist theory, but until further notice, only as a consequence of our working hypothesis. Whereas in the phenomenology, it was supposedly a short result. In analogy to sense data, whose admission Wilfrid Sellers rightly castigated as the myth of the given. So he was not a friend of sense data, nor am I. But in analogy to sense data, pure being would then have to be described as a thought datum. In grasping a datum, thinking becomes similar to sense perception, insofar as the latter is supposed to grasp sense data and becomes what has been called intellectual intuition by Schelling and Fichte and others. Hegel disdains this term and is content to say of pure being that if one can speak of intuiting here, it is only the pure empty intuiting itself, or, which amounts to the same thing, the pure empty thinking itself. The act of thinking, the thinking subject, what is thought, or the act of intuiting, the intuiting subject, and what is intuited, all fall into one hair at this utterly indeterminate and immediate beginning. So, and let me stop at this point for today. We'll have to go on to the next steps and better understand what I said today in the next lecture in January. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Koch. It's a very interesting talk. And I think next we're going to move to Professor Zhang Zhenhua's comment. Shall I say something very briefly about Professor Zhang Zhenhua, our commentator today? Professor Zhang Zhenhua is a professor at Shanxi Normal University. He is specialized in German idealism and has authored 3 books and published more than 30 articles. Okay. Time is yours.
Okay. Hello, Professor Koch. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, yeah. See you.
Yeah.
Hello. Nice to see you.
Yes, we have not seen each other for 6 years.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your thought with our students. It's my great honor to comment on your lecture. Thanks for your thoughtful lecture. You provide us one feasible way to read the phenomenology, which is quite unfamiliar to scholars in China. You have explained the course of the first half of the text of phenomenology as a input-output apparatus, and because the second half has not reached the fixed point of overlap of the forage and the in itself. So you also have explained the latter as continuous correction and also as a filling in of materials from the philosophy of objective spirit and that of absolute spirit. In my opinion, this means that Hegel's phenomenology is a half successful and half failed work. Half successful because it demonstrates the profound reciprocity between certainty and truth in Hegel's sense on different levels of consciousness. Half failed because it has not fulfilled the task put forward by itself. It seems you present the phenomenology as a thought experiment, but in my eyes, the 5 different forms of consciousness, namely sense, certainty, perception, understanding, self-consciousness, and reason, represent respectively 5 spheres of our conscious life. The conflicts between the forage and the in itself are not only about our self-conviction and the mutual conviction between us, and the 3 forms of spirit, namely spirit, religion, and absolute knowing, also demonstrate actually some sort of essence of the history of the Western culture. For example, the twofold worldview from the Middle Ages, down to the present day. So my first question is, if you were Hegel, how would you write the phenomenology? Number 2.
Luckily, I'm not Hegel. Okay.
Another thought experiment. Number 2, in the framework of logic, you distinguish between the foreground logic and the background logic, and further within the latter between the designer perspective and the user perspective. It seems you have endowed us readers with much freedom because you have opened up a huge space for us outside the necessary development of the logic, which looks like closed. This is undoubtedly an instructive analytical access of research to the logic. The logic involves in certainly many people, including the readers and Hegel himself. What they think obviously cannot be taken as the same as a pure thought in the logic. The problem has usually been omitted by many scholars. But if we turn upside down the thing and take the designer perspective, the user perspective and their difference as starting point in order to cut into the inside structure of the logic, this seems still quite questionable. As we all know, in the introduction to the so-called greater logic, Hegel said so. It, namely pure science, contains thought insofar as this thought is equally the fact as it is in itself, or the fact in itself insofar as this is equally pure thought. Therefore, the second question is, how can you avoid the danger of reducing the logic to some lower standpoint, which has not reached the sphere of logic? And how can you, in the course of the movement of categories of the logic, keep distance from that danger? Thanks.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Professor Zhang. These are indeed very helpful and interesting questions. I hope I can say something which helps to get clear about them. So with regard to the first one, let me say this. It seems that Hegel initially thought that the input-output game, he talks of the reversal of consciousness. So we put in the in itself, in sense certainty, just individuals, and then chapter 1 shows that the output is general traits by which these individuals would be accessible to us. So, and then we have this reversal. We use the output, that is the general traits, as the new input, and look what will happen then. Okay, so input-output game, of course, that is my term. Hegel, of course, couldn't use it. It was just an invitation to imagine what is going on with the help of this device. So it seems that Hegel initially thought that the input-output game of the phenomenology would reach its fixed point, that is the identity of input and output, at the end of the chapter on reason. That would be chapter 5. So that a short and final chapter 6 could portray absolute knowing, and that would be it. And then he could enter into the logic. So that, I think that was his plan originally in Jena, to write this science of the experience of consciousness that leads to absolute knowing after the shape of consciousness entitled reason. That would be a short introduction, half of the text that we have. But then and I just follow Eckhart Förster here in his interpretation, then he must have realized in writing that this was not the case. At the end of the chapter on reason, the fixed point didn't come up, so the input and the output didn't converge. So he had to go on, and well, then he was in a hurry because the editor was eagerly waiting for the manuscript, and so he, well, in a way, got lost a bit. He couldn't just follow strictly his nice input-output pattern any longer. He saw that he had to add materials from the history of cultural development, the history, well, life forms, ethical forms, morality, and all that, which is labeled under Geist, objektiver Geist. He had to put that in, and he, in a hurry, did put it in. But that was a bit messy, it seems to me. So he added these two long chapters, and only then the fixed point of absolute knowing could be attained. I think that in the end, he, well, forced the fixed point. It was attained in absolute knowing. Not at the end of the chapter on reason, as he had hoped, but at the end of the whole of the phenomenology, he thought now he had reached this fixed point, absolute knowing. And so, well, he was through with the manuscript and sent it to the editor, but he was not very satisfied with the way that he had finished the manuscript. He wrote that to Schelling as an excuse. So how would I write the phenomenology if I were Hegel? Well, I think I would do what he in fact did. Abandon the idea that a science of the experience of consciousness must precede the logic and the whole system, and place the materials of that science, that is the phenomenology, in the philosophy of spirit. That is in the third part of the philosophical system. That's what he did later on. And I would just do the same, I think. The philosophy of spirit, as we all know, has three divisions: Abteilungen, subjective spirit, objective spirit, and third, absolute spirit. And now the first 5 chapters of the phenomenology, sense certainty, perception, understanding, self-consciousness, and reason, go, as we all know, into the division on subjective spirit, in the middle part of it, which is headed the phenomenology of spirit consciousness. And chapter 6 goes into the second division on objective spirit, and chapter 7 on religion into the third division on absolute spirit. So I would do nothing else. I would, if I were Hegel. And now the actual fixed point turns out to be the fixed point not of the science of the experience of consciousness any longer, but the fixed point of the whole system, absolute spirit. That's the real fixed point. And so, in a way, all is finally well, at least in Hegel's view. So everything turned out right for him. We may, of course, have our doubts, but Hegel thought that was it. And with regard to the second question, let me point out the following. You quote Hegel on the difference between the phenomenology of spirit and the science of logic. And I add one more sentence. The whole passage that you quoted reads, if you begin with the sentence before your quotation begins, pure science, the science of logic, thus presupposes the liberation from the opposition of consciousness. It contains thought insofar as this thought is equally the fact, Sache, as it is in itself, the matter of fact as it is in itself, and the fact in itself insofar as it is equally pure thought. That's what you quoted, end of quote. So, pure science presupposes the liberation from all presuppositions, and in particular from the one mentioned here, namely the opposition of consciousness. So the opposition of consciousness vanishes. And Hegel here describes the main contrast between the method of the phenomenology and the method of the logic. The phenomenology contains as its topic the opposition of consciousness. That is, the opposition of the for it, the fact as it is for consciousness, and in itself, the fact, Sache, as it is in itself. So this opposition is the topic of the phenomenology. That's the finite consciousness. So we have three levels in the phenomenology. First, the phenomenology itself, that is our theory, our background theory. And second, the fact as it is for consciousness, for it. And third, the fact as it is supposed to be in itself, the in itself. So these three levels are there. Our background theory, the phenomenology, then consciousness with its internal opposition. Two levels. In the science of logic, on the other hand, the opposition of consciousness has vanished. That means that the for it and the in itself have merged. And this is exactly what Hegel says in the sentence you quoted. Pure thinking and pure being are one and the same now. Pure being, which is pure thinking, exists in and for itself. This is now the foreground level. And we, as theorists, as Hegel and his readers, with our background perspective, look at this matter of fact, at this fact that is at thought insofar as this thought is equally the fact as it is in itself, or the fact in itself insofar as this is equally pure thought, as Hegel put it. So the thought datum, pure being as not a sense datum, a thought datum. In this datum, the fact, the matter of fact, pure being, and thinking, pure thinking, come together, are merged. So the foreground logic doesn't have the opposition of consciousness any longer. There's only two levels, our background logic and the foreground logic, pure thinking proper. We have no longer three, but only two levels now. The lower standpoint, in fact, the finite standpoint of consciousness has been left behind. And now we can, to quote your words, avoid the danger of reducing the logic to this or any other lower standpoint by keeping this two-level structure in mind. This entails that we must always remember that the Hegelian categories are not predicates like in Kant or Aristotle, that is, not unsaturated half-thoughts in need of supplementation by singular terms, but complete contents of thought, that is, complete truth claims. Well, of course, I think that this doesn't suffice as an answer, but I invite you to just insist on the points.
Okay, thank you. So if my understanding is not wrong, what do you mean is as following. The freedom of consciousness cannot be destroyed and disappear into pure thought. It must always stand on itself.
The freedom of consciousness,
cannot be destroyed absolutely.
Okay, so but what do you mean by freedom of consciousness? Could you just
freedom of thinking,
of thinking,
of thought, of
thought.
Subjective thinking.
Okay, the freedom of subjective thinking. Mm-hmm. But I didn't want to intend to say anything on this freedom of subjective thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So consciousness is our everyday finite thinking.
Yeah, sure.
Well, we are free in this. Yeah, we can think of this or that. Of course, when we want to make truth claims, we bind ourselves to what is the case. So in consciousness, and now Hegel, the later Hegel, says we don't need the science of the experience of consciousness any longer as a preface to the science of philosophy. We could just, through freedom of thinking, decide to try to think purely. That's what it says in the encyclopedia. So this is the freedom of thinking. We could freely decide, make the decision, the resolution, oh, let's try to think purely.
Yeah.
That is our decision. And this would be the new starting point of the logic. Yeah, okay. So, and the phenomenology is not needed any longer as a preface, so it is relegated to the later part of the system, into the philosophy of spirit. It doesn't function any longer as an entrance into the scientific system. So, the entrance is now provided by our resolution, our free resolution to try to think purely. Then we stopped, and we try to figure out what could that mean. How should we begin if we want to think purely without presuppositions? And then that's the way I think we get introduced into the logic, by reflecting on this homework. Try to think purely.
Yes. Okay, maybe we can leave this question to the future discussion. Yeah. Now, I thank you very much. Now, Now, I would like to leave the time to Dr. Xiong, Dr. Tang, and other teachers and students. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Zhang.
Thank you both. Now I think we have some questions from the audience. We have an assistant who can read it to you and you may reply. Okay.
熊老师。
哦，该我了是吧 ？OK。
熊老师，Okay. I thought we have some questions from the audience already, but no, Professor Xiong, you can proceed. If you have a question, just be great.
Okay, thanks Dr. Tang's moderation. I have first two questions from Professor Wenjun Niu, the professor from East China Normal University, because her Zoom software got some problems, so she can ask the question herself. And on her behalf, I raise the first two questions from her side. So there is also some opening messages from Professor Niu. Nice to see you again, Professor Koch. Thanks very much for your wonderful lecture. It's a pity that our Zoom doesn't work right now, so I have to write my questions via Bilibili. The first question is about your definition of background theory. I wonder why it is approached in external reflection instead of in internal reflection. As we know, Hegel opposes the external reflection, and even the Reflexionsphilosophie der Subjektivität, such as in Kant, Jacobi, and Fichte. For instance, in Hegel's article Glauben und Wissen. The second question about the concepts, the absolute knowledge and the absolute spirit. These are two very big conceptions in Hegel's philosophy. Why doesn't phenomenology of spirit end with the absolute spirit? What's the relationship between the two concepts? That's all.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Good questions. Yeah, the second one is particularly intricate, and I wish I had a good answer to the second one, but okay, let me start with the first one. So, yeah, Hegel, in his younger years, was very critical of what he then called external reflection. But of course, there are many, many possible grades of externality. So think of not the science of logic or the phenomenology, think of, let's say, a mathematical textbook, Introduction into Set Theory. So in this introduction, you will have a lot of external reflections that lead you into the theory, intuitive explanations, and a very, very external reflection would be that the author says, well, the axiom of choice is my favorite axiom. So this is just a personal statement. That's my favorite axiom. Very external to set theory. It doesn't matter for set theory that this is the favorite axiom of the author. But there are other external reflections that are closer to the mathematical theory itself. And so the same goes on in Hegel's logic. When Hegel, in the opening of the logic, says that pure being is immediate and indeterminate and incomparable, these are external reflections very close to the matter of fact itself, to pure being. So this is not just saying Schelling didn't like immediacy or something like that. That would be very external. It's external reflection and still essential for theory building. So the background logic is all external reflections, but external reflections that try to pin down the matter of fact. Well, there are grades of externality, and Hegel has these Anmerkungen, the remarks that he adds to the main text. And there he talks about the history of philosophy, for example, as pure being that was the content that Parmenides grasped as the first philosopher. So this is very external. But what he says in the main text, that is external reflection and essential for what he is talking about. Internal reflection, this is what pure thinking itself does. It is internal reflection. And at the very beginning of the logic, there is not much of internal reflection there. It's just immediacy and indeterminacy of being. So pure thinking qua pure being doesn't have much structure. It has no structure at all. So its internal reflection is empty. So I think that Hegel is well aware that what he does in the book Science of Logic is all external reflection, describing the internal reflection of thinking itself. That's the foreground, this logic, the internal reflection of pure thinking. And that's the topic of the Science of Logic. So much for to the first question. The second, absolute knowing, absolute spirit. I think that when Hegel wrote the Phenomenology, he had not yet decided, or he did not yet know how the science of philosophy, logic and real philosophy, would in particular have to be developed. And so he called the fixed point at the end of the journey of consciousness absolute knowing. Okay. And then he realized that this absolute knowing, this fixed point, couldn't be attained in that way that he thought it could be attained in the phenomenology. Or let me put it another way. He just rearranged his whole conception of philosophy, and the phenomenology went to the philosophy of spirit. And then it turned out that its fixed point, that was called absolute knowing in Jena in 1807, was the fixed point of the whole system. And it got a new name, absolute spirit, because, absolute spirit, absolute spirit has three forms: art, religion, and philosophy. The real fixed point absolute knowing then would be philosophy, Hegelian philosophy at the end of the system of philosophy. That would be absolute knowing. The science of logic or the encyclopedia of philosophy. It is its own fixed point. So much, perhaps, for the questions.
Okay, thank you, Professor. On behalf of Professor Niu, then it's my questions. So the first question is very short. I think it's also a general question, perhaps also on behalf of audience. Why after phenomenology still the science of logic? Why this transition from the phenomenology to the logic is necessary? Why we just stop there at the end of the phenomenology of spirit? And the second question is logic's presuppositionalist beginning against presupposition in general, or only specifically against proposition in relation to propositional logic, propositional knowledge? For example, this is also the objection from Robert Pippin. Pippin said in his new published book, Shadows of Realm, he said the presupposition, absolute presuppositionlessness could be impossible because we have to presuppose the subject of the logic, say the thinking as such, and we have to presuppose this resolution to think purely. So the first one is a kind of theoretical presupposition. The second one is a pragmatic presupposition. So I wonder if this presuppositionless requirement is absolute or just very specifically against some propositional knowledge. And the last question is the inseparability of being and thinking a part of our working hypothesis if we leave the phenomenology aside, just the logic alone? Okay, that's all.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so first question, why not stop with the phenomenology of spirit? Well, I think that Hegel in the Jena time had the impression, so there is this new scientific philosophy, Schelling is doing it. Well, not in a perfect way, but well, Hegel, am here to make it better. So now after so many of thousands and thousands of years of human evolution, consciousness has finally reached the stage where there is a science pretender among many. There are other philosophical positions there that compete with Schelling and Hegel. So the Kantians are still there, and the Humeans and the empiricists are all still there. So it's just at this stage, and when Hegel was working in Jena together with Schelling, it was just a brute fact that among all these philosophies, there was now one that was the final winner, but not yet manifested as such. So Hegel had the idea of, let me give a logical reconstruction of the history of consciousness from its very early beginnings, when humans ceased to be animals, sense certainty or something like that. A sketchy, logically articulated, not historical, but logical reconstruction of the way of consciousness to the present moment, where Schelling's philosophy of indifference with Hegel's additions has appeared. Let us portray that. And then it will be obvious that this is the real philosophy. And then we start with it and we develop it in a science. So it's the way to the starting point. That was the idea in the phenomenology. And then after that, we begin with nothing, presuppositionless, because the absolute knowing at the end of the phenomenology just shrinks to indifference, to nothing. So it's the night of spirit about the phenomenology ends with the night of the self-consciousness of spirit, and spirit has to start anew, Hegel says. Later on says, well, we could do just by decision, do that by decision, by resolution. Why start with the phenomenology then? So we can decide or resolve to be to think purely. And this now leads me to the second question. Is the requirement of a presuppositionless absolute? Well, yes, in a way, the requirement is absolute, I would say. And this, well, of course, in propositional thinking, predicative thinking and propositional thinking, there's always the bivalence, and there's always the possibility of negating a sentence. So the sentences come in pairs of contradictories, P and non-P, Q and non-Q, and so on. So how to start without presuppositions then? If you say P, there's also non-P, and the skeptic says, give me a P, and I'll show you non-P.
Equilibrium attack.
Okay, and so it is clear that we have to go beneath the propositional level if presuppositionless is taken seriously. Or at the propositional level, we have to start with an inconsistency, P and not P. That's the topic of my next lecture in January, that Hegel starts with a contradiction, like being is nothing and being is not identical to nothing. They have P and non-P, two opposing sentences, and that is what the skeptic would do. And Hegel wants wants the skeptic to be on his side. He wants to say, okay, we have to start on this contradiction and then work our way out of the contradiction in a logical disaster management. And the logic is all logical disaster management, I would say. So, and yeah, I would say then this requirement is meant in an absolute sense, and resolution is not a presupposition in a sense of a theorem. It's just
pragmatic.
Pragmatic. Well, it's a working hypothesis. Maybe we end up shipwreck. Maybe nothing comes out of that. Just let us try. If we have the phenomenology, we at least know that it could be worked out. But without the phenomenology, it's just a kind of thought experiment. Let's pretend, maybe. Let's pretend there is a presuppositionless theory. How should it be like? What should the initial stage in this theory be like, and how should it continue? So it's just a working hypothesis, a pragmatic resolution, not a substantial presupposition, I would say.
Okay.
And the third one is, the third one was whether the identity of being and thinking at the beginning, whether that's part of the hypothesis. No, I would say that is a consequence we draw from the hypothesis. So if the hypothesis works and there is something like a presuppositionalist theory, we have to start with pure being, and then we see that pure being has to be identical with the thought of pure being. But this is not something presupposed. That is something which is already deduced from the working hypothesis. It must be like that.
Okay, but consequence also a part of hypothesis, I would say.
Yeah, okay, of course, everything is a consequence of the working hypothesis in the end. So the whole of the science of logic is a consequence of the working hypothesis. And the working hypothesis is always in danger that at any point in the development you could say, oh, that is too much, that is too crazy, that's just inconsistent. The working hypothesis must be wrong. Or you can try and take another little measure and see whether the thing can be continued. But the working hypothesis is always in the background, and what leads you forward.
Okay, perhaps a following remark. So to the questions, the second question, then the presuppositionlessness is not absolute, I would say. It's only for the pragmatic sake we have to presuppose this resolution, but
Yeah,
theoretically it's absolute.
Well, but yeah, for the pure thinking, it is absolute. For us, of course, we just have this working hypothesis and try to build up a theory which is presuppositionalist. But what we build up on the foreground logical level, that is absolutely is required to be absolutely presuppositionalist. But this is our requirement in external reflection in the background theory.
And on the theoretical level, it's only against the propositional knowledge, right?
Yes, but this is a result as well. If one tries to start to think purely and to think without presuppositions, one of the first things we learn is that then this thinking is presuppositional, must be presuppositional. And this means that its topic and the thinking must be identical, must merge. Like a sense datum is its own presence. So the act of
sense data is surely something below subsentential entities. That's why I say if you compare the sense data, Russell's sense data with Hegel's thought data, perhaps, or thinking data, then it must be beneath the propositional level. And that's why I raise this question, is this presuppositionlessness only against the propositional knowledge?
Well, yeah, but I would say it's one of the first results you get if you start with the working hypothesis.
Okay, so I was told that Huazhong also has her question, so let's turn to Huazhong's questions.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
You're welcome. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. I feel highly honored to be here again as a student representative to ask some questions posed from our teacher and our students. The first question is from Professor Yang Yufang. And she asked, how does exactly the transition from consciousness to self-consciousness in the phenomenology of spirit occur? And the second question is, which function do the force and understanding therein have? And, or rather, why the infinity can make the consciousness turn to self-consciousness? Yeah, these are her questions.
Okay, so yeah, see, I didn't say a word on that, so it's just left that out. But I can try to add some remarks. Well, I start with the second question: the role of understanding in the passage from consciousness to self-consciousness. So Hegel, in the first chapters of the Phenomenology, considers what he calls consciousness. Sense certainty is not successful, then perception, and there we have the dialectic between what is nowadays called bare particulars and bundle theories of things. So we have this contradiction. Things may be either bare particulars and some general traits attached to them, or there may be bundles of qualities, and in this dialectic is not successful either. It leads to the understanding, and the understanding is portrayed as a kind of cognition or knowledge that looks behind what is present in perception. So in the understanding, we talk about the essences of things. We talk about, not just phenomenal water, but H2O. So that's the hidden essence of things. And then in the chapter on the understanding, the third chapter, Hegel shows that the scientific explanation is in a way circular. So we explain the phenomena by, in the hypothetic deductive way, by hypothesis, general laws that we postulate. And So these general laws, how are they justified? Well, they are justified with respect to the phenomena they are there to explain. This is this kind of circularity. The laws are to explain the phenomena, and the phenomena are to justify the laws. So it's not a real explanation. And Hegel says, look, here the understanding is dealing only with itself. It's an inner circle of the understanding. The understanding talks to itself in its laws and in the phenomena that are to be explained. So it's just a monologue of the understanding to itself. And then this is self-consciousness. Yeah, exactly. In self-consciousness, we are conscious of ourselves. In self-consciousness, I'm conscious of myself. So the understanding in this circular way is conscious of just itself. The understanding believes it has found some basic laws of nature, but it's still the understanding what has been found. So this is self-consciousness. And this is the transition to the next chapter, self-consciousness, I would say.
And here are some questions from our students. There are 3 questions, and they compose a whole series. Firstly, why did Karl Marx treat Hegel's phenomenology as the real origin and secret of Hegel's philosophy? And secondly, but why did Hegel condense his phenomenology into a small chapter in his later encyclopedia? And finally, how do you think about the relation between the phenomenology and his whole philosophy?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So Karl Marx, yeah, I don't know why he said that. Maybe that he knew the phenomenology best of all of Hegel's works. I'm not sure whether Karl Marx really studied the logic. May have studied the lectures of Hegel and may have studied the theory of objective spirit. That was particularly interesting to him because it treats of society and economics. But yeah, the phenomenology has this charm of Hegel's first opus magnum, his first work, great work. And so it's all there new and interesting. And maybe that is why, and then the phenomenology is rich of all kinds of topics. And it has this dialectic of slave and master in the 4th chapter. So I think that was appealing to Marx. And the condensation, okay, the condensation, why that? Well, first of all, the encyclopedia is a condensation of the Hegelian philosophy as such. It's just this encyclopedia in outline. So even the logic is condensed there. So the logic, the large logic, is 3 books. And within the encyclopedia, it's just a small part. And so everything in the encyclopedia is condensed, even the phenomenology of spirit. What is more interesting than the condensation is that now the first 5 chapters of the phenomenology, they are put into the philosophy of subjective spirit. And the 6th chapter on spirit is put in the philosophy of objective spirit. And the 7th chapter on religion is put in the part on absolute spirit. The condensation as such is not problematic because, as I said, the encyclopedia has to condense it. And then the third question, well, the phenomenology of the system. I said something on the 3rd question in passing now when answering the 2nd one, and answering the very 2nd question of today's questions relating to absolute knowing and absolute spirit. The phenomenology by Hegel was supposed to be the logical reconstruction of human consciousness up to the point where the systematic scientific philosophy could begin. And so much of what was said in the phenomenology, of course, will then show up again in the system of philosophy. But phenomenology shows the way, and then the system develops philosophy internally, strictly and scientifically. Okay, I think that was it from my side.
All right. Any more questions?
Yeah. Here again, a new question from our students. Let me read it. Plato talks also about the presuppositionlessness of the knowledge. Do you think that Hegel, with his conception of the presuppositionlessness of the logic, has made a progress in contrast to Plato? If yes, can you explain it to a Plato reader?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question, nice question. So I think what the questioner is referring to is the Phaedon, where Socrates, in his intellectual autobiography, explains how he started philosophy and doing dialectics. That is, we have to start with, in philosophy, in a certain certain context where certain persons are present in a dialogue with something that is accepted by everyone there. So we have a group of friends, or not only friends, but opponents, maybe 6-7 persons, and we want to talk about a philosophical topic. So we have to start from something that everyone accepts. And so this is a trivial presupposition, and then we deduce from this position other theorems until some of the participants says, oh no, I can't believe that. So if that follows from the initial the starting hypothesis, I withdraw my consent and I dissent now from this initial hypothesis. And so we have to go back to something which is still less mute, which is more trivial, which is more neutral. And so we can go on and on and on till we reach a point where something is unhypotheton. So there's no hypothesis any longer. It's just the unbedingt. It's the unconditioned, the unconditional. So this is Plato's idea there. Let's go back to what is unconditional in this way. I think Hegel was inspired most of all by the Pyrrhonian skeptics, more than by Plato. So the Pyrrhonian skeptics that said, let's doubt everything. I, the skeptic, won't say P. I will only say, it seems to me that P. And if you give me any P, I'm able to show you that non-P. So this is, I think, Hegel's model, more than Plato. The presuppositionlessness is a requirement that permits us to work together with a skeptic. But okay, Plato in his own way tried to start from something unconditional.
So, but we have 1 more minute. But may I ask a question in relation to this question? So how do you think the difference between Hegel's project and Descartes' project? Because Descartes starts from nothing. It looks like similar projects.
Yes, yeah, sure. Descartes was the one who, in a way, introduced the topic of skepticism into modern Western philosophy after the medieval time. And sure. But Descartes wrote about that which could be doubted with reasons. So he was a bit more cautious than the Pyrrhonian skeptic. The Pyrrhonian skeptic thinks anything can be doubted. Descartes says we need some reasons for doubting what we want to doubt. So it's not just a free decision by Descartes. And this is important for him, because otherwise he would never be in a position to start anew with science. So his procedure is not that radical as the Pyrrhonian one. So he always gives reasons for doubting in the first chapter of the Meditations. Well, let's doubt the foundation of what we know. That is perception. That's the universal foundation. If we doubt that, everything will collapse, will break down. So what reasons should I have to doubt what I perceive? Well, I have made mistakes. I know that I made mistakes. I misperceived things. But then comes the anti-skeptical move. Oh, yeah, sure. But then there were no standard conditions of perception when you misperceive things. So if the conditions are optimal, you won't misperceive, and perception will be reliable. Okay, second move. But I remember of having dreamt. So, and then the dream argument comes, and then it goes on with the demon, the false demon. So Descartes always gives reasons for doubting, and then comes to a point in the second meditation where he has found something which cannot be reasonably doubted any longer. So I think, that is clear, and if I think, in a way, I have to exist.
Right, but the question is, by contrast, do you think Hegel is trying to do anything substantially different from Descartes?
More radical. So, yeah, Descartes comes to this point where he starts with self-consciousness in a way. I'm conscious of my own thinking.
Right. Okay.
And so this was later taken up by Kant, and in a way by Fichte as well. The I posits itself initially, Fichte says, positing in a logical sense. So it's the first thing that it gets to know itself. And for Hegel wanted to be, well, then at least then you have a certain topic, subjectivity, the I, the res cogitans, as Descartes says. You have a specific topic that you start with. And in Hegel's logic, you don't know what to start with at all. You don't have a topic. And of course, Hegel would say, in the third part of the logic of the concept, it turns out that pure being that we started with has been subjectivity, thinking I, all the time. So then he, in a way, joins Descartes, but from beginnings which are more austere and more radical in skepticism than Descartes. In the end, it turns out that, yeah, the concept that is self-consciousness, that's the I.
Great. Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Koch and everybody, Professor Zhang and Professor Xun and our teachers. So we're looking forward to your next lecture, which is on next Friday.
No, it's in January.
January, okay.
Yeah, okay. So it's a break now. Yeah. Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Tang, for your moderation, and thanks all of you who asked questions. And it was a pleasure to me to talk to you. Seeing you all again now.
See you next time.